Hey everyone, and welcome back to The Negotiation. On today's show, I am thrilled to be speaking with a very good friend of mine, Cyril Ebersweiler, General Partner at SOSV, the Accelerator VC, who is best described as a visionary punk. We begin our conversation talking about how he ended up in China, first as an intern with Carrefour, later becoming their first e-commerce project manager all the way back in 2002, predating the first iPhone by 5 years, just to put that in perspective for you. Fast forward to 2009, which is when we first met in the northeast of China in a coastal city called Dalian. This is also where he met OSullivan, the now Managing Director of SOSV, which back then was more of a super angel fund or family office fund, whichever you prefer. I asked Cyril to tell about why the two of them decided to start investing in early stage tech in China and what that conversation was like when even Silicon Valley was in its adolescence. We talk about spinning up accelerators in China as an investment model and why Shenzhen was the best place in the world to launch a hardware accelerator, due in large part to the shanzai movement, which we explain in the show. We also talk about the impact crowdfunding platforms like Kickstarter have had on the world of hardware startups, ending with a prediction of where the next biggest company will come from. Enjoy.
What we wanted to do was to convince the entrepreneurs and actually the parents even. And I seriously had calls with parents of applicants, to the accelerator, and provide them with some sort of, cocoon where they could just, have some money, then have a group of people, and then, building sets of resources essentially to support their first step development. And so, popularizing the fact that being an entrepreneur is okay.
Home to over 4 billion people, the Asia-Pacific region boasts one of the most powerful consumer markets on the planet. Not only is it home to half the world's under 30 population, but it's also home to more than half the world's internet users. It's a market no globally minded brand should ignore, but entering markets like China is no easy task. Just ask the likes of Microsoft, Google, Uber, and Facebook. Times are changing, and with the right partners, doors are slowly opening as more and more companies find success expanding into the markets of the Middle Kingdom. I myself spent 8 years in China, mostly as a venture capitalist, helping early-stage tech companies enter the Asia-Pacific market successfully. This show is dedicated to uncovering and examining successful China entry and growth strategies by interviewing the people behind those success stories. My name is Todd Embley, and welcome to The Negotiation, brought to you by WPIC Marketing and Technologies. Cyril, my old friend, thanks for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
You and I go way back, but not nearly as long as you and China go back. You first came to China in 2002, is that correct?
Yeah, as a professional, actually, that's correct. But I was traveling to China since 1998.
So when you came back to China, this time professionally, it was like 2002 when you started with Carrefour. Talk a little bit about those early days and how you ended up with Carrefour.
Yeah, so I got quite lucky here because as I was having multiple students' job, if you will, I happened to meet with one of the board members of Carrefour, and he introduced me to some of the folks out of in China. And interestingly, Carrefour, the Jalafu over there was just at the very beginning of its expansion. Essentially, there were about 13 stores. The largest one was in Beijing, and nowadays I think Carrefour has hundreds and hundreds of stores across the country. And I out of all odds, I landed the internship that eventually became a job. And I haven't looked back. For the last 20 years, I've been abroad essentially.
And that was to do with e-commerce, right? You were involved in the e-commerce side of what Jalafu was doing in China.
Yeah, it was just the beginning of it, and I actually started as a clerk, which could come as a shock after having studied for 5 years and having a master's in business. But it was kind of the school of life, learning about how a store functions essentially for the first few months, and then being a force of proposition about new things that we could do. And back in 2001 and 2. Was really the beginning of the e-commerce and internet, and including in China, and in particular some ideas about how would you deliver from a store, which obviously today sounds very normal, but back then was a whole new endeavor, and so I proposed to start essentially delivery out of the store, and built up a team of about 25 people that were shopping inside of the store, delivering to people, and people were ordering online.
So can you talk a little bit about what it was like back then as far as how people were shopping online?
This sounds like prehistory and fun, I guess, for the oldest the oldest listener to this podcast, I guess. But obviously, the internet was kind of wonky back then, and we had to go step by step as well into proving that people wanted to get things delivered and that we could do it economically. From a store perspective and margin perspective, and so we actually started by just sending emails to people that were leaving their contacts in store, literally, and building database and sending a PDF of things that they could actually order, and so it was very manual, just exchanging emails. Then inside of the store, we actually had a bunch of people on rollerblades, believe it or not, that were going around the store to figure out if the products were there, because of course there was no way to check real time what was in the inventory, and of course there is no warehouse. The warehouse was the store, and so now you can imagine a store like that in Beijing was about 1,000 employees, and 2 floors and thousands and thousands of people at any given time of the day, and people in rollerblade just running around and trying to fetch and fight over some chicken or something, and then they were coming back into a little office, and then we had a whole brand that we built around it, and we had actual trucks, and those trucks were twice a day just going around Beijing and delivering, and that was kind of the beginning of it, and then of course we started to improve on that with a second phase, which was equally horrifying to everybody, because we were sending .exe files, for emails that were opening a browser, and then people could just, select things in there, and then, click send, and he was sending an email. So, just a step further and better. Before, 6 months later, we were able to start to pull off some kind of online website, more properly.
Were you aware of the behind-the-scenes political, like the business political landscape that was going on? I'm interested at Carrefour really invested heavily at a much, much earlier than most other companies. Best Buy tried to come in 2012 or something, and I mean, here Carrefour predated them by 10, 15 years. Were you aware, or can you speak to what it was kind of going on as far as anything that they had to deal with as far as hiring talent, leasing the spaces, getting the trucks, dealing just with the entire environment? Was it better? Was it easier? Was it more welcoming because not so many foreign companies had tried to come to China?
Yeah, I think Carrefour was quite. I don't know how special it was, but there was already an intent to make it, very local, and that was a very important step. It sounds obvious. You go to China, you have to localize your brand and localize your operations and whatnot. But back then, people were still thinking that they could just come over and figure things out. And we've had the likes of Groupon and others many years later that made mistakes in thinking that you can just come in and be foreign essentially. That's why Carrefour became Jialufu, which is a great play on words from happy people and home and all those concepts, and at the same time out of the 1,000 employees per store, or hundreds of employees per store, typically there was one foreigner, perhaps the boss, or zero foreigner already back then, and people were trained up in stores around the world, or trained up from the ground up over there. I do remember that most of the battles were around supply, essentially, and getting, from there was a lot of competition from local supermarkets, and of course they were, pre-existing to Carrefour methods, and so there was a lot of competition there. There was competition with Walmart as well, which did an excellent integration as well into China and development. For the rest, it was a time where you could, everything that I pulled off, which was, with a small team and, getting trucks and getting, uniforms and getting something going essentially from scratch, was extremely easy. Granted, there was the umbrella of, a powerful brand or brand in the making that people recognize, but at the same time, it was just, easy to make things work.
After you left Carrefour, you spent a little bit of time with Adidas, but then you ended up with Air France for a significant amount of time. What was Air France's entity or establishment in China? What was it there for? Why was Air France investing in operations in China?
Yeah, so it's a very different business. The product essentially is France. So most of the
like the country or
the country,
tourism.
Yeah. For tourism, or business or anything, but
right.
Encouraging the fact that people will go to Europe. Well, not only France, to be fair, Europe sure. as a whole, but with some French vibe. And so what locally was happening was the product is essentially having multiple connections and multiple lines, starting from the major cities, but also exploring how to open new cities and connect them to Europe, essentially. And so when I was there, I think, we started with 2 flights, per day, essentially, one from Shanghai and one from Beijing. And as I, left, 3 years later, there were multiple more cities, with openings of Guangzhou, of Chengdu, and other lines, essentially. So the product, was being developed. And then a big part of it was, to support the fact that people will rely more and more on the company, and both from a direct consumer perspective as well as from businesses. And so what I did there was develop some sort of big back office, which was supporting the growth of the company.
So then after Air France, you went on to join T BWI. And this is where you started to get into more the marketing side of things. When did that happen? Where did you go? What were your first projects like?
Yeah, so the reason why I went to T BWI was because I actually wanted to go to Japan. And the reason why I wanted to go to Japan back then was because this was pre-iPhone, and essentially, back in 2004 and 5, it was quite obvious that mobile technologies will, become a thing, and Japan was at the forefront of having, applications on mobile phones, and so.
And this was 2006, about a year before the iPhone even came out.
Yes, 2005, 2006, and Japan got, unfortunately wiped out by the iPhone, many years later. But it was a great, kind of view into the future about, mobile usage, mobile apps, mobile marketing, mobile payments, and I started to work with multiple brands on, developing their mobile offerings, essentially, and marketing in Japan and then also in other countries from Japan.
Talk a little bit about what you were doing that brought you back to China.
Yeah, so I spent about 3 years in Japan, developing, just like any business, the clientele out of Japan, and then there was actually an interesting development that was happening at T BWI with one of their entities that actually needed to support Asian business at large, and in particular clients out of Japan and Korea and China. and think about doing below the line and above the line, or actually through the lines, because we actually did some TV shots and whatnot. But essentially, marketing materials and campaigns for big brands like Johnson & Johnson and others. Pan-Asian campaigns and support. And so what was interesting about this was to try to figure out where to go next, and what was the place that would actually be able to support such an entity that was good geographically, culturally, and able to support those three countries at once.
You ended up going to Dalian, and why
Correct.
did you choose Dalian?
Yes. So overall it was quite in a way obvious. That Dalian was a good city because the three cultures / languages were represented there. Japanese were using Dalian as a what we used to call BPO, business process outsourcing centers for quite some time, but also factories. Like YKK has one of its biggest factory in the world over there, and it has also proximity with Korea. As well as cultural minority that was speaking Korean, being really Italian is just a few hundred kilometers far from North Korea and South Korea, of course, on the other side. And of course, it was in China and very convenient to fly to Shanghai or Beijing. And so that's how we came up with setting up an office in Dalian, which obviously not many big foreign businesses did, although we had SAP there and quite a few others, but also really creating a huge competitive advantage in terms of being able to service those clients all throughout Asia.
So this is where you met Sean OSullivan. And so Sean OSullivan, for the listeners who don't know, Sean OSullivan, this is where SOSV, the Accelerator VC, the venture capital firm that you're a general partner at, this is where it all went down. You actually met Sean OSullivan. Of all the places in the world, you met Sean OSullivan in Dalian, China. Tell us a little bit about how that happened.
Yeah, just like, any other good stories, I guess. It's always about showing up on one side. So, like you may wonder what, moving from, I did at that point, Shanghai, Beijing, Guangzhou, then Tokyo, and, back to China in Dalian. What the hell are you doing? And actually, it's good things happen when you start to be true to convictions and
trust the universe.
Trust the universe and move forward, essentially. And I also a bit of luck because Sean was back then running also a company on top of his family office, if you will, and came to our office. Because we've removed the ceiling, essentially. That's the bottom of it, because we were running a call agency, and we just removed the ceiling.
It was the design of your office. It was the
exactly
design
that got him to come over. But the fun story is, of course, he came once, and since I was traveling a lot, I wasn't there the first time, and that could be the end of the story. But he came a second time, and so we got to meet face to face, and he actually just literally came to my office, like he didn't even ask for permission, which are things you can do in China, I guess, to some extent. And I still remember thinking that it was like, oh, I'm an entrepreneur in China, and me answering him that this was a very difficult endeavor.
Okay, so I'm going to fast forward a little bit through this walk down memory lane. It's been interesting, but so this is where you and I actually met when you were with eGraphics, and I remember having dinner at your place. I think you were kicking my butt at NBA Jam at the time, or FIFA, which you just love to destroy people at. Take no mercy at all. And you said, oh, by the way, I think I'm going to be leaving eGraphics, so I'm going to join this fund, and I'm going to start an accelerator. And I said, what is an accelerator? And you proceeded to have to explain to me exactly what an accelerator was. So I'm very, very interested in this, and I've always described how this went down in various ways, probably never getting it absolutely right. You and Sean wanted to start investing in early stage tech in China. And so that's how a conversation devolved into how in the heck were you going to do this? And this conversation was actually happening in 2009. So tell us a little bit about what you were seeing. Why would you want to do this? Why would you want to do something so inherently difficult and be the pioneers of doing it? Tell us a little bit about how that all went down.
Yeah, I always had a thing for technology and even startups, and they were startups have always been quite close to what we've done at T BWI because we needed to be at the forefront of technology and in order to provide our clients with some perspective on what they could do and in what kind of future displays and devices and support they could imagine as well. And so it wasn't a big jump to think that we wanted to support early stage entrepreneurs. Sean was an entrepreneur and myself as well, and so we had some good operational expertise here to provide to entrepreneurs. Doing it in China was actually also because we saw an opportunity to work with talented people. Amazingly, back then there was a huge risk aversion for building companies from scratch, and if you were to be coming out of Tsinghua and whatnot, going into building a startup was borderline madness for parents in particular. They wanted you to go to either the government or a state-owned company or an international company, and being an entrepreneur was kind of the last choice that you could make. And so what we wanted to do was to convince the entrepreneurs and actually the parents even, and I seriously had calls with parents of applicants, to the accelerator, and provide them with some sort of cocoon where they could just have some money, then have a group of people, and then building sets of resources essentially to support their first step development, and so popularizing the fact that being an entrepreneur is okay.
You also launched the hardware accelerator Hacks. It was the first in the world. It's still the best in the world. Tell us how that came to be.
Yeah, actually, it was both Leapmotion and Farmlabs as well. That is a 3D printing company where that we were the first investors in back then, so we had a few investments. Even for China Accelerator, there was a few hardware companies, if you may recall, and just being a good investor and on the mission was the idea was how can we support those teams better, and of course we were located in China, and people were calling it the manufacturing hub of the world, or country, or I forgot what's the proper thing it was called, but essentially, or the factory of the world. Yeah, there you go. But essentially, I took a trip to Shenzhen, thinking that all hardware is in Shenzhen in China, which isn't true at all. But Shenzhen was, of course, some sort of epicenter, not necessarily for manufacturing, but actually for supply chain in particular, in terms of electronics, had factories surrounding it. But what I saw over there was actually at a very different time, what I saw over there was something called shanzai, and so shanzai, which is not really a thing anymore today, 10 years ago was essentially what people called Chinese incremental innovation. And in hardware in particular. So shanzai was, knockoffs first of phones and electronic appliances. But shanzai was kind of more than that. It was some sort of hackery culture that was mixing things together. Sometimes it was borderline silliness, like the thing that really encapsulates shanzai was a phone that had a razor embedded in it, and I remember looking at that device, which was sold for maybe $50 or something, and wondering how that was possible. And so this is when I understood that, or kind of the insight was that, well, if there are probably 10,000 units of this thing that have been made, maybe 20,000. I don't know what's the total number. But the fact that it could be done at the first place as a unique product, not in the millions, but, in the low 10,000s, and that could be, that cheap, meant that there was a system behind it. And I was like, oh, actually, what if we put startups in that environment? Are they going to be able to prototype, faster, and take their products to market faster, while also not going broke? And so that's how the idea of implementing hacks in Shenzhen came up.
What were you seeing? If you could look at North American entrepreneurs who you've worked with extensively, and then Chinese entrepreneurs who you've worked with extensively, what are the similarities? What are the differences? What are the pros and cons of both?
Yeah, actually, it's quite interesting because we, never been an afterthought, but we ended up having, 10 to 20% of every batches, being Chinese, and the rest being, foreign at large. Typically, maybe 50% North Americans and 20 or 30%, Europeans and whatnot. First of all, it was great because you could really have, those very different cultures under one roof, but also business cultures, essentially, on one side getting things done, on the other, selling things and communicating them. And we, there are some cliches that were quite obvious, I think back then, but that now are less and less obvious. Essentially, about okay, great, the entrepreneurs in China can be proactive and build stuff, but they have a hard time to sell abroad, essentially. And for foreigners, going into China is always very difficult, and getting things done essentially is almost impossible. And so we spent quite some time, in trying to make the environment smooth, and kind of take the best out of both worlds, and iterating on the way we do things. So just to give an idea of how it looks today. We have about 50,000 square feet of an office space, which is shared by several hundred entrepreneurs essentially in the room, and they are all able to exchange about their best suppliers, or the best way to do things, or the best investors, etc. Which is a very useful way for them to develop their company. And over time, if the teams are spending enough time on the ground, and most people are spending at least 6 months to a year now at our office, if they are foreigners, and same thing for, of course, the Chinese being there. They start to develop on one side the Chinese DNA of being extremely productive, and I would say nowadays the attention to detail is tremendous. And then on the other side, they can learn about how to communicate about their offering better, and open up some distribution channels, on the other side of the world. So it's been quite exciting in that matter.
Why was it valuable to launch hacks in Shenzhen? Why was it important to be there in the world's factory?
Yeah, the way I describe it is, there is a very famous quote from Milton Friedman about, the world is flat, which means that, essentially you have some sort of commoditization of the world, and, everywhere is the same, or everything is global, which is, very valid. If I were to build on that, I would say that, there are actually spikes that are, existing around the world. And the first one was actually Silicon Valley, and there is, no mistake that this place became, an epicenter essentially of the world nowadays, and is, powerhouse in terms of capital and technology at large, and therefore it's a different ecosystem. And every time I think about ecosystem, I think about essentially, imagine yourself, you are building a certain type of company, and you go to a certain place in the world. And the way to recognize if an ecosystem or one of those spikes essentially exists is if you are automatically augmented by just being physically there. And when you think about that, there are very, very few people on the planet where this is true. And that will depend, of course, of your industry and the type of product that you propose. But in the case of Silicon Valley, there is no doubt that you come here with, any kind of startup, but in particular, software or consumer, software, and etc. And you will find that the value of your company is augmented because there are lots of people giving you devices to get started with. There's also, of course, the capital that is available to fund you, et cetera, and talent, of course, to join your company. And essentially, the same can be said about Shenzhen when it comes down to hardware entrepreneurs. Just by being there, they are automatically augmented by the ecosystem surrounding them. The supply chain. I call that the long tail of the supply chain. Essentially, the fact that you have really big factories that startups don't use, down to the mom and pop shop have machine shops for injection molding or CNC machining, just one or two persons doing work, but being extremely flexible and fast and reliable. That can essentially take you from your data to a real product, and holding your hands through that, not getting frustrated too much for it, hopefully, and then the supply chain, in electronics, being available. And then, of course, the knowledge of the people, in building things. So, same as Silicon Valley, just different here. And I would expect that, those spikes essentially will keep on going. There will be, there are, obvious epicenters for certain things, in fashion or in finance and whatnot. But when it comes down to technology companies, I would think that we'll see, the rise of certain cities that will shine and be different, and that people will want to go to, in order to build their company, at least momentarily, but, also for the long term.
Hacks graduates have had incredible success on Kickstarter, and I want you to talk a little bit about the impact of the crowdfunding campaigns, especially with regards to the world of hardware. And once they were successful on fulfilling their campaign so that it wasn't a scam campaign, was that it? Was success done and dusted? Were they already successful, or was there just another trough of sorrow they needed to get through after that?
Yeah, so we, funny enough, we're of course well known for doing crowdfunding campaigns, I guess, because we've done, over 100, and we have, I think, 13 or 14 of the top 100 of all time. But actually, consumer hardware is only like 20% of what we do, and the majority nowadays is B2B and health related. But that aside, we've of course been exposed to crowdfunding at large, crowd equity as well, which is a different thing. But at least on the crowdfunding side, the fact that the companies will launch the product and see if there is an interest, essentially, was always very beneficial. And if I will redo everything, I will say that. It's a good way to test if there is some product market fit to some extent. But at the same time, we always were reminded, I would say, that the types of consumer buying into crowdfunding are early adopters. And as such, there is, a little bit to read into it. And actually, through the 100 and then some campaigns that we've done, it's quite obvious that you can, do a campaign that does $100,000 and become a really successful, company. And actually, funny enough, one of those is not one of ours, unfortunately, but very well-known fact is Peloton actually launched on Kickstarter, believe it or not, back in 2010 or 11 or something. Did back then a good campaign, across 100K, but it took much more, to make it a successful company. And on the other hand, of course, you can pick the biggest consumer hardware campaign of all time, which is Cooler, which blew up $10 million twice, right? That folded just 3 or 4 months ago, and is a non-existing company anymore. So yeah, you cannot read too much into crowdfunding as much as you would like to.
So what happens if you are successful in your crowdfunding? And I know this is where hacks played a large role, because you could return and then you could manufacture and ship and actually fulfill all your promises from your campaign. But what happens next? You've had a successful Kickstarter campaign, but how do you actually become a successful company?
Yeah, so first of all, some things to be said about all the backers of those campaigns, and they are. I don't know how much they realize that they've taken their face into those little companies, and those stories are an amazing tool, and amazing for innovation at large, and the lives of those entrepreneurs and those companies. And yes, sometimes things don't turn as expected. But when I back campaigns, and I do that quite a bit, and not only hacks companies, I expect to get a good story out of it, and that's it. They play, that plays still a very important role in the lives of some of those entrepreneurs and those companies. And so backers, so keep on backing, I think is important for everybody. What's next is actually extremely difficult, because those companies most likely will still need to fundraise, depending on where they land at with their goals and whatnot. There is still, limited cash, because building a product still costs money, and, tooling costs and shipping costs and all kinds of things. And, you can have good economics and still be tight at the end of the day with it. And it's very rare to have companies that, really have their things together and are able to essentially break even on their own operations with a limited team. That said, that's definitely where those companies want to go to, because nowadays getting investors excited about consumer hardware is difficult. And most will expect to get some sort of recurring revenue coming up, but that takes quite a bit of time to prove out. And so the likelihood is that those companies will raise venture money, and then they are kind of on that treadmill where they have to ship their product the first time around, and then immediately after kind of have a V2, which is removing a lot of the shortcomings of V1. Same thing happened with the iPhone, and you remember probably the antenna issues on one side, or the folding phone on the other, and so it's never perfect the first time, and so companies needs to get onto a V2, and then closer to product market fit with it, and then continue on developing a portfolio of products, because it's very rare that a consumer company can survive just on one product.
I want to ask you one last question. You are a trademarked visionary punk. Where is the next big company coming from?
The next big company, actually, I tried to make it happen many years ago at Hacks. Hilariously, we had two companies facing each other, and we had a very small office back in 2012. It was I think 100 square meters or something.
I remember.
And we had two companies there. One was called E-Link, and the other one was called Spark. And during the Hacks programs, Spark was originally working on some smart lighting solutions. It was an American company, and E-Link was working on a platform for IoT objects, and they were Chinese, and there was some tremendous affinities between those two companies, so much so that for a reason that's still enough to this day, Spark became a purveyor of IoT products, a platform. And E-Link became E-Light and did smart lighting in China. So they literally cross each other, in terms of trajectory. And today, Spark is called Particle. It's a really large company out of in San Francisco. And E-Light now is the largest smart lighting company in China, and that's part of the Xiaomi empire, if you will. But those two were like literally four people facing each other in the office. And I actually tried to marry them together back then. Of course, it's really difficult to do. At those early stages, they have their own ideas and whatnot. But one thing that came out of this is the fact that the next big thing will come from the perfect blend between that US feel and that China feel together under one roof. Literally, leveraging the best out of both cultures and strength, and I'm looking forward to see that in the future.
Yes, I remember the Kickstarter campaign video from Spark, which was absolutely hilarious. I remember when you sent it to me for the first time, you actually have to see this. There's so much subtle humor going on, especially when they were showing that they were running some video ads in China, but running Mexican music in the background, and just so many hilarious parts of it. They were pretty hilarious guys, and there was a lot of fun. Those were just the great days, man, running those accelerators. So fun. Thank you, buddy. Thanks very much for coming on. I really appreciate your time today. Why don't you let our audience know if they want to get in touch or apply or just follow along with anything SOSV or yourself is doing? Where can they do that?
Yes, very simple. www.sosv.com. I think every program's out there, and don't hesitate to shoot me some notes on LinkedIn.
Excellent. Cyril, thanks very much for coming on the show once again, and it's been a true honor, and I hope to have you back on again soon.
Same here.
Growing a company is hard. Doing it in a foreign market? Exponentially so. The best piece of advice I can give you is not to do it alone. When you start looking across the pond for further expansion possibilities, and I sincerely hope that you do, make sure you choose the right partners to do it with. My good friends at WPIC Marketing and Technologies have almost 20 years of experience helping brands, just like yours, enter China. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The Negotiation, and if you're interested in being a guest or want to connect with me or any of our team, please reach out to us at podcast@wpic.co, and be sure to rate, comment, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Zaijian.